later. So please let us know whether you'd like a link to that. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Data for Indigenous Justice Executive Director and Native Movement Gender Justice and Healing Director, Dr. Charlene Apok.
Koyana, Kathleen, and the rest of the ANTHC team who have been supporting all the technical aspects and getting everything up. And I just really appreciate being here, and thank you for inviting me. I'll also do my introduction, and you'll see my slide and my background have two different organizations, and that's really to recognize I have two full positions in two different orgs, but we work together, and then also share about some other team members as well. But thank you all for joining. And again, I'm going to kind of high point some of the information so that you all are able to ask questions on things that you find more helpful or that you want more details on. So it might feel like it's moving fast, but really it's to give you enough information so that we can spend some time answering questions at the end. All right, next slide. So Vanga Charlene Apok Ganupraxis Ka Akpik, Chinik Mu Gurunga Suli Kachirvik Mu Gurunga, Akaga Sandra Baby Lu Apok, Iknaga Evan Luklan, Savaktunga Native Movement Me Suli Data for Indigenous Justice Me. My name is Charlene Apok and my Nupak name is Akpik, and my family comes from Gullivan in White Mountain, Alaska. My mother is Sandra Baby Lu Apok, and my son is Evan Luklan. And as I mentioned, I have two co-positions. So one is that I'm the Gender Justice and Healing Director at Native Movement. And the other is I'm the Executive Director of Data for Indigenous Justice, which is the organization that homes Alaska's MMIWG database. And so I'll be sharing from a little bit from both of these organizations and other partners. And then also feel free to put questions in the chat for the support team to harvest, and then we can get to those at the end, but feel free to ask them as you like. So before I get started, I do want to acknowledge and recognize, especially before talking about data, that these are our loved ones. These are missing women and girls and other people in our communities that are real faces, real people with real families, real lives. And so sometimes talking about research and data can feel a little sterile, but we do this work in a way that we honor these relationships and remember our responsibility to our loved ones. And so I just want to acknowledge that, before talking about numbers, that these are real people and real faces. And so I think that's important to do before going too far ahead. The next slide is also letting you know a little bit about Data for Indigenous Justice. Our organization is not quite 1 year old yet. So at Data for Indigenous Justice, I'm the founding executive director, and I have a background in health research. And then more recently, I was able to finish my PhD, and that PhD is in Indigenous Studies. And prior to that, I worked in health research, and I have a master's in rural development with an emphasis on circumpolar health. And the Data for Indigenous Justice Board is compiled of an Indigenous women's leadership team. So Jody Potts has a background in law enforcement, and Abigail Echo-Hawk is at Urban Indian Health Institute, and she has a research background, and her organization really led the way in some of the first reports, national reports on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And Dr. Malia Villegas is with the Fognak tribe and was previously at NCAI doing their policy over there, so policy background. They're a wonderful leadership team that I'm fortunate to meet with regularly, and they are guiding this work and myself as we do this and listen to our community. So I just want to acknowledge other people who are supporting this work. And then just a little bit about our purpose. This is the most wordy slide, I promise. But really, Data for Indigenous Justice, we really wanted to put this organization together to make sure that the data that is being collected is for the use and benefit of our people, that is meant to protect us and not harm us. And that's really going to be used to serve us, which we haven't always seen with research and data, right? And so we really make sure that we take care of the forms of data that we have, that we steward it, and that we use it in a good way. And thinking about, how to benefit our past and our future ancestors. And so I just want to put that out there and to share those intentions of how we take care of the information that we're given. And I also want to recognize partners in this work. So I'm one speaker today, but Data for Indigenous Justice and Native Movement are part of Alaska's working group on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. And so other people who do this work day in and day out and are very dedicated, and we meet with these 5 orgs every single week, are Native Movement, and then NPA Community Fund, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And so I just want to acknowledge those partners and the people from those teams who do amazing work as well. And I'm so thankful to work with them. And some of the pieces about some community events coming up that I'll be sharing are with the support of these folks, and that we do this really closely together. So I just want to acknowledge the other women that I stand alongside and work with, and men. Next slide. So what this has looked like, again, pre-COVID, we say that so much in our language these days, pre-COVID, it's like a term now. But we really do this with and for our community, and we do this in a healing-centered way. So in addition to all the data things we'll be sharing about, there is a lot of community engagement. And when I was talking with Debbie and Kathleen about what would be most useful for this webinar, they said, oh, share about the community work. And the reason we try to be so transparent about that is because sometimes people say, oh, can you come do that in our community? And while we would love to, the reason we also share about it is so that other communities can get ideas and feel inspired and organize in their own communities. And so some of the ways that this looks like is we hold a vigil usually every year, and that's coming up on May 5th. And I'll share a little bit about that in the next slide, where we come together and have a healing space for us to be with one another. And again, we'll have to adapt this year with COVID and everything. But some of the events that we host are things like, in the picture on the right was actually a beading session. So beading those red dress earrings together. We've done painting together. We've done talking circles together. And on the left, there's other local community actions, such as doing local resolutions. And if any of your communities would like the language and the documents to those, we're so happy to share them. So if you want to have a local resolution where they recognize MMIWG as an issue so that you can build off of that for actions, we share this out again so that we're transparent in what we're doing, but also so that you can do it in your own communities as well. Other events that we've had are things like, such in September, this working group hosted a virtual 5K, and that had like over 500 people registered and participated, not just within the state, but national and even internationally. And so there's lots of things that your community can do to bring people together, to raise awareness, or just to have that healing space to share with one another. And again, that's done in partnership with so many orgs. And I want to also share that again before all the data, because we do it with a healing-centered approach, right? So we don't want to try to encourage and ask our community members and you all to like take action without really pausing and reflecting and honoring how heavy this work can be, and that it is heart work. And so that's why we also really try to have all of these events that take care of each other and take care of ourselves when we do this work, acknowledging again how hard it can be. So what are some of the events coming up? And what does this community work look like? And again, this is one so that feel free to participate and look into it, but also organize it. So if there's things that you feel like, oh, I would love to do that in my community, please reach out and we can share, templates of things that we've done, like registration packets or any language around resolutions and things like that. So here are the 2021 events for the MMIWG 2S Alaska Working Group. So every month, just this Sunday, actually, there was an Indigenous Women's Gathering. And again, that used to be in person, but now it's online. But it's nice because now we can have people from all over. And that really is just a very casual and informal gathering space where people bead and things like that. And come together. There's also men's gatherings. There's one in April coming up, so you can look out for those events. And then our next event coming up is this one that's titled Spring, the Canoe Journey Project. Kathleen has also been supporting that work, which is super awesome. But we'll be building a canoe that memorializes and is dedicated to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The dates are still being firmed up, but the goal is to have the frame completed by May 5th for this May event, which is May 5th, and we'll dedicate the canoe on that day. But May 5th is National MMIWG Awareness Day, and so there's lots of things going on in social media and communications and things like that. And then we're planning on streaming an event, so look out for that information. Other events that we do with our community, and again, you can find these on Facebook under MMIWG2S Alaska page. That's our working group shared page where we put all of our events. And then we have some other plans for things like art shows, doing the 5K run again, maybe in person, maybe virtually. And then we do Indigenous Peoples Day, and we usually organize also around AFN time. So just keep an eye out for these things on social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook, and then all of our orgs, you can see them there as well. So I just wanted to share again some of the ways that we bring community together, and that these are things that, feel free if you have more questions about. Or if you organize something, we're happy to share it out too and uplift all of the good work being done across the state. So I just wanted to share a lot about, what we do to bring people together on this topic. And then the other part of this presentation was to share about recent data. So I think a lot of folks on this call might be tuning in, have different positions within the healthcare system, or if some of you are tribal administrators, and just it might be useful to have information about the data. So this next part of the presentation is specifically going to kind of be wearing my Data for Indigenous Justice hat of homing the Alaska MMIWG database. And I want to recognize this beautiful artwork was created by Dustin Newman and was given with permission to use this image. And then also, before jumping into the next slide, I want to share the background a little bit about Data for Indigenous Justice and why is data even important on this. It might be something you all probably already know, but just contextualizing the need for it. So a couple of years ago, there was a rally to bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Alaska. And when organizers went to go, they wanted to read the names of our loved ones at a rally. And when they went to go do that, there was no database, no way to pull their names. And so those organizers took it upon themselves to start that list and that database with our community. So our community came forward and gave those names of, hey, this was my loved one. And so that became the beginning of what is now a database that is homed at Data for Indigenous Justice. Why is that important? So probably if you're coming from a tribal community, or you're in, different capacities, and you're trying to write a grant, or there's all of these things that we know and live every single day in our communities. We know that this happened in my family, or this happened in a family that I know, that then we don't have numbers or any information to say this is what we are experiencing. And so without that data, we can't advocate for our needs. We can't advocate for the realities of what we're facing. We can't allocate and advocate for the resources that we need to address this. The other part of this is holding folks accountable and agencies accountable to being able to say, this is what is happening, right? So the data, again, can be useful in so many ways. And prior to this, we didn't have any data to speak to what we were experiencing. And so we started to do that with the way that I described earlier on with the rally. And some of the efforts to reclaim the data, it looks like many different things, and I'm going to just quickly high point. And again, if this is an area that you're more interested in, we can do it during Q&A. But one of the main methods that this database uses is from the community. So people offer their loved ones' names and information for us to steward. The other way is through Freedom of Information Act requests. And you'll see that kind of picture on the top left. And those are requests for public information that's available. And I almost always have FOIA requests pending. And then we also use social media, such as the Seeking Alaska's Missing Facebook group as an example. And then we also have worked with NamUs, which is the federal database, which some of you may be familiar with. And then we have local partnership. So for example, with APD, we work pretty closely with them on getting some of the information that we need. So it can look like many different things. And again, I'm happy to revisit any of these. One of the challenges of collecting this data and having this information is with this little race box right here. We're all familiar with filling out forms on our race and ethnicity and heritage, and we know all too often that sometimes these are the only options given and we can only click one. And none of us really truly fit into these kinds of boxes of demographics. But what happens, let's say, if you identify as Alaska Native and Black, and you can't click both. Well, let's say you choose to just click Black. Well, then we lose information on your Alaska Native heritage, and vice versa, to be honest. But anyways, there's lots of ways that collapsing of data happens within many different systems that we lose track of our people in. And so it's very important to revisit these basic demographic areas. And again, that whole box right there, we could talk a whole webinar on. But Data for Indigenous Justice does have some recommendations on how to better capture some of those. So we can talk about that another time if you'd like to connect more. And then one of the questions we often get is, where do we stand as a state and also in comparison with other states? So going back to when I mentioned Abigail Echo Hawk and the Urban Indian Health Institute, in 2018, they put out this report on the right-hand side here. And that was the first leading edge report in this nation to document missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And in 2018, Alaska had the 4th highest number of sheer cases, right? So this isn't per population or anything like that. This is just sheer numbers. At the time, in 2018, when this first report got put out, Alaska had the 4th highest number of cases at 52. And that was with them reclaiming data that wasn't available previously from law enforcement. So that was just in 2018. Data for Indigenous Justice has been homing and keeping track of the data since then. And we just put out our first report in February, so last month. And this is what I'm going to share next, where we are today. So as of February 2021, when we released this report last month, Alaska has 229 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Alaska. 149 of them are in missing status and 80 have been listed as murder. And again, like I can't emphasize enough that like we know and we live these losses, right? These are our real loved ones. But it really matters that us as Indigenous people are tracking our loved ones. Because even in that short amount of time, we went from 52 cases to 229. And again, I can talk more about this in depth, but these cases, there are so many more. Even from the time that this report was pulled, there's a 10-year data set that has been updated to this data. So again, I just want to acknowledge that this is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to knowing what we're really dealing with. And we know that from our lived experiences. We know this day in and day out. We know our loved ones in our communities are missing. And we need the data to reflect it so that we can advocate for the resources we need to address it. So this report is available. These are screenshots from a really beautiful report that was designed by Yaruin Creative. I want to give them a shout out because it's just lovely. But this can be found at Data for Indigenous Justice website. So dataforindigenousjustice.com. Under the database tab, you can download this PDF report, and then you can have this information for whatever you needed to advocate for or to cite or to, link to. But feel free to check that out on our website. These are the numbers that are most current. And then, there's other aspects to the database that I think I'm just going to kind of mention. And again, if it's something you want to discuss more, we can. So for example, one of the questions we often get about this report is, okay, but how many of these are for my community? How many of these are happening in X location? One of the barriers to having that information, why it's not reported in this report, is because the data that we pull from agencies, particularly from law enforcement, are not clean enough to really reflect where we're missing people from. So for example, if someone from my home community from a small village goes missing or murdered, the paperwork often gets filed, as we know, in the closest hub. Or let's say that person came to Anchorage and that's where the incident happens, which is actually very common, which is kind of how it goes oftentimes. But then that means that the home community doesn't have paperwork, or they don't have a way to say, actually, that person is from here. That person's a Newback, or that person is from, such and such village. And it just gets filed as an Anchorage case, right? So again, there's so many ways that we have missing data and unclean data that personally, when I was writing this report, I didn't think it was clean enough to share out by location. So that's an area of opportunity for us to work together as a community to start reclaiming and decolonizing our data that accurately reflects our people and where we're from. So we could talk about location, race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality is another one that could be better improved. And then cause of death is another one. So we have people in our database, for example, who I'll share, for example, my mother. She passed away in 2003 and her death was listed as suicide, but most of our family really doesn't believe that it was suicide. So my mother's name is in our database because we, as family members, don't believe it was suicide, that it was murder, right? So that's another way that I feel like our database at Data for Indigenous Justice, again, more accurately reflects our people's experiences. So there's those data points if you'd like to ask more questions and better understand, or if you'd like to understand the methods of capturing the data, how we clean it, anything like that. If you want to talk about submitting data, we can also talk about that. If you want to learn more about the community events, I can answer questions about that. But before we jump to Q&A, I did invite some other wonderful folks that we work with are the Alaska Native Justice Center. So one of the things with that working group that was mentioned earlier, we get so many questions about direct services, and unfortunately we don't have the capacity, and it's not within our programs right now to provide direct services. So often one of the things that we do is we try to give people reliable resources that they can actually connect with and get direct services for tribes and/or individuals. And so I reached out to my dear friends at the Alaska Native Justice Center and just let them know I was doing this webinar and was like, hey, is there anything you'd like me to share? Well, we have this group of folks on the webinar because I think it'd be, again, most useful for you all to know what information is available, and then we can answer questions. So we have the Alaska Native Justice Center. They sent me these slides, and I just want to pause for a second and see if Alex or Kelsey are on the call and want to speak to their slides.
Hi, Okpik. I'm here. This is Kelsey.
Cool. Do you want to share with folks about your slides?
Of course, of course. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for including us today, and a big thank you to ANTHC for putting on this webinar series. And we're really happy that you reached out to let us share this information with you. So I have the contact information for the Alaska Native Justice Center on this slide right here. There's our email. You can send us questions, our main line, and we are located across from the DeBar Braga Costco. Services are somewhat, they're mostly virtual at this point. So it's best if you call or email if you have questions. But we are ramping things up. We are going back into the building, and so things are going back to somewhat normal. But what we wanted to do today was just really briefly share the kinds of services we offer, and then also, let you know how we're situated in this work. So we provide direct services to people, and we also provide direct services to tribes. And while our services might not be directly, to address the missing and murdered crisis that's going on in our community, it's all connected. And I think that we all understand that fairly well here. And I think in different ways, our services to people and our services to tribes address that. Do you mind moving the slide forward one? Okay, so there's a picture of our beautiful building that we will be back in soon. And so, one thing to know about the work that we do at ANJC, we are not a 24-hour crisis organization. But we partner with several, like Awake or Standing Together Against Rape. But what we do have are advocacy services and legal services for victims and survivors of crime. And as you can see, we have services for domestic violence and sexual assault victims, human trafficking, and victims of other crimes, with a focus on youth and elders. And so that can include also stalking, different types of harassment as well. And our family law team is there to help with, it could be something as simple as a pro se clinic, which they typically run on weekends, and that can help someone get a divorce, custody, guardianship, and they're expanding those services as well. And And so what we're trying to do is offer wraparound services. We also have for elders, crimes against elders. This could be neglect or exploitation. We also offer end-of-life planning. For youth, we have 2 programs. One's on the next slide, but we'll stay here for just 1 second. But we offer mentorship and coaching for youth who are enrolled in Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and we also offer a Color of Justice education program for youth, and that is designed it recruits youth who are underrepresented in the legal profession, and it gives them kind of like a 2 or 3 day camp where they can learn about legal professions. That's one way to get more Alaska Native youth or other underrepresented youth into the pipeline, because we need more representation in the legal service industry. And one thing, I'm just looking through my notes and seeing what I may have missed. One thing that ANJC does offer is with our advocates and advocacy team is it's intense case management. It might not be the direct crisis services that someone needs, but you'll have an advocate that's there to walk alongside you and to make sure that your decisions are respected, that your voice is heard, and to help you navigate all of the different legal systems. It gets really complicated really quick should you be victimized. So that's what we offer. And if we don't offer the service in-house, something you need, we are very adept at offering referrals. All right, can I have the next slide, please? Okay. And so the referrals, one thing is it could be substance abuse referrals. I forgot one thing. And also connecting people to behavior and medical or behavioral health services. So those are some of the other types of referrals that we offer. So we also have reentry programs. And this is for adults and youth. So this is mostly in the South Central region. So youth who are at McLaughlin or somewhere in South Central can work with our program managers. In the education, I think I mentioned the pro se clinics already. So if you need legal services, there's certain types of legal services you can do ourselves. Those are available. And so we try as much as possible to offer wraparound services, offering services or referrals that will maximize victim safety and healing. And a critical element of everything we do is the cultural responsiveness. And this can include cultural and wellness activities. It might also be social and emotional wellness. And there are also women gatherings and support groups. And I understand that those are all still happening virtually at this time. And additionally, the last part that I'll share from our group is the services for tribes. And these are mostly housed at this time within our legal team. And this is where my position is situated. So I'll tell you a little bit about the ICWA program that we have. We have ICWA attorneys that will represent tribes with ICWA cases that are in the South Central courts. And so we can also offer consultations throughout the state. Let's say, for example, if Kayana had a case in an Anchorage court or in a Palmer court, our attorneys could help them. For tribal justice systems, I'm a tribal court facilitator and we have a growing team. But what we do is we offer a variety of activities that are related to strengthening tribal justice systems. And this can be training and technical assistance. We share resources, we develop resources. And the reason that we have this program is, much of what Akpik just explained. When we look at the resources, we look at the justice systems that are currently available to Alaska Native women, we find that they are not meeting the need, that they are insufficient. And though small, tribal justice systems offer that local response. They know their community. They know how to keep their people safe and how to protect women and children. And so this is why we support this work. I mean, there are a multitude of reasons, including, protecting, exercising tribal sovereignty, but we want to help ensure that there is a response when something goes wrong, when someone is victimized in a community. And you can address programs locally and early on. And so if you have any questions about any of these programs, I can help connect you to the right person within our organization. If you have questions about the Tribal Justice Support Program, I'm happy to answer questions. And I think that's all, Akpik.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelsey. I
Thank
want to
you.
take the youth training.
We can invite you.
Some of the things I say often in this work is I needed a law degree yesterday. And I really do believe in transforming our justice system to serve us. So, lots of shared work and initiatives and wonderful partnerships with all these organizations. And just thank you again, Koyanukpuk, to ANTHC for having me. And again, I know it might feel like that went really fast, but the intention was to open it up and answer some questions from you all. So I'm going to stop share screen because then I can actually see people and the chat. And then I'm happy to answer questions to the best of my ability. And I think Kelsey can stay on too, if that sounds okay.
We did have a question come up earlier. Is this presentation, the PowerPoint, will that be made available?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
All right, making sure I can still see you all. All right, Kathleen, did you want me to go through the chat questions, or did you have any that were sent directly to you?
Well, we had one just come up. I haven't seen many questions come up yet. But Margaret David just shared in the chat. She says, I presume, thank you. Sorry, I'm not familiar with this language. Thank you for this work. I am a midwife at ANMC. What would you want women's and reproductive health care providers in our tribal healthcare systems to know and do to better support this work?
Yeah, Anabasi, Margaret, and thank you for joining. Specifically for what you're asking healthcare providers in our tribal healthcare system is to really listen to the folks who come in and build that relationship and trust them to know their own body, selves, stories, and be willing to, just truly listen. There was, for folks on the call, sometimes healthcare providers, for many situations where women might be unsafe or need access to services, their point of entry, as you all know, is the healthcare system. Is it the right, point of entry? Sometimes not. It's a mismatch. But I think that knowing that and being able to direct them and provide that information to send them safely in the right direction, I think can really make a big difference. But if we don't initially take that time and space to truly get to know them where they feel safe sharing and having that connection, then we miss that opportunity to provide service in the right way or that intervention that's so desperately needed. I know working in MMIWG and some of the cases we come through, that have come through that I read, is that sometimes the last people that women are sometimes in contact with were their providers. And so don't underestimate, the impact you can have by being a good listener and really connecting with women. I know it can be really busy in a healthcare setting and you feel rushed and you only have 30 minutes appointments. I know everyone, you do so much, but really building that connection can be a life-changing point. So thanks for that question. And it's a really important one.
I guess I just want to invite anyone who does have questions, like feel free to unmute yourself. And while you're maybe thinking about that, I just wanted to share this comment from Barbara Franks. Just a note to you all, thanks for making this presentation available for others to listen to the wonderful work you're doing. As I continue to work with suicide awareness in Alaska, this comes so close to many who feel they're alone and no help is being done. Ganolchis, ganolchish.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. As we've been doing this work, we realize how, well, we know that we're all touched by this work and that we're all impacted by this work. And one of the things that with that first report, and oh yeah, thank you for putting the link in the chat. With that first report, with reporting out 229 cases, we all are familiar with that number. That's the number of tribes we have in this state. And I don't really believe in coincidences. And so we know, that number truly, it emerged for this first report because we are all impacted, all of our 229 tribes up here. So I think it is very telling and very representative of what we're facing. And what I was getting at with that comment, and thank you for writing that, is that this is very intersectional work, right? So it does overlap with suicide and suicide prevention. It does overlap with perinatal and prenatal and maternal child health care. It does overlap with our justice system and tribal courts. And one of the things that we often say while working in this work is that we say we're seeking justice on every front. And what that looks like then is that it means that everybody is accountable, but it also means that everybody has a part of being a part of the solution. We all can be a part of this, no matter which field you work in or which community you belong in. And sometimes it isn't always, right, being in the rally or the front lines, but sometimes it's doing fundraisers or donating or having families in your, conversations with your families and raising awareness. Sometimes it's sharing things on social media, and sometimes it's giving pause and listening to the families and really believing them when they say they don't believe this as a suicide. It can look like so many different things, but everybody really is and should be a part of this solution in addressing this issue, because this isn't something that happened in an isolated way. And so I think we all hold responsibility and can be a part of the change on this area. So I'm glad that came up. And if you have questions about, your line of work or other ways to be involved, please ask. We have people who donate their artwork. We have people who have offered videography services or all of these different things, and of course we always accept donations. We are nonprofit organizations, all of us who are working on this. But there are lots of ways to be involved and to make a difference. So if there's, if you wonder about that, let me know and we can talk through, different ways to be involved. And you saw some of the events, so, keep an eye out for those on social media and the registration and what that looks like too. And again, feel free to share out those events so that we get people involved. And one of the blessings of this COVID world is for communities who do have access to internet, we've been able to engage a little bit further reach than I think we were able to before. So it's one of the good things.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Carmen.
Sorry. Hey, good afternoon. My name is Carmen Pitka. I work here at the Children's Advocacy Center here in Bethel, Alaska. And so I've been here a little over 3 years. And one thing that I see when we're advocating for families that come in from the smaller villages surrounding Bethel, Alaska, so we deal primarily with victims of crime, and the caregivers come in with their families from either the Bethel region or here around the Bethel region, so the smaller villages that surround Bethel. Anyways, the one thing that I'm hearing is, we haven't heard from law enforcement, or we haven't heard from the district attorney's office. And so what I pulled up was like how a typical criminal case is prosecuted in Alaska. And so I'm trying to find either scenarios or something related that we come across. That way it's helpful for the caregivers. And like, because one thing that we do here is, oh, the suspect is still walking the streets in my village. What's happening here? So I'm just wondering if anyone can share resources or something that I can either mirror or something that we can recreate for those families.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carmen. That brings up another working group that I want folks to be aware of. And there's a couple of responses, and unfortunately it's because there isn't a straightaway answer. But I'm going to offer a couple leads that hopefully are somewhat helpful. Office of Victims' Rights is great. Thank you, Colleen, for putting that in there. So in Alaska, there is a federal MMIP coordinator, and her name is Ingrid Cumberledge. And she, with her working group, which is mostly made up of law enforcement, but I know that there's a few tribal reps, and the Women's Resource Center has representation on that working group. They are building out, they're doing some pilot studies in 3 communities with a toolkit that they developed to kind of walk communities through that process. The details of those 3, I can't recall, but one of them is like if you're a community without law enforcement, if you have VPSOs, and then one I think is for larger communities. But that would be something worth looking into to see if they have that available for those pilot communities. The other one is that the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center is launching a toolkit that they have been building for over a year. And so I actually was attending those monthly calls with them. And so keep an eye out with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center for their community toolkit. And then I know this isn't encouraging, but one of the things that I have found really useful in working with law enforcement, for lack of a better word, is asking really good questions about the process. What is your process for? And get those answers. What is the process for? And get those answers. Because sometimes we are so caught up in a very sad and tragic scenario that we're like, this happened. And then we expect someone to say, okay, this is what you do. And unfortunately, we know that that isn't always the response. So being process-minded oriented when we have something like that happen, and it forces them to be accountable to the process they state they're going to follow, right? So I know that isn't ideal, but it's something that I have found helpful. And Kelsey, I didn't know if you had any other information that might be helpful for Carmen.
I think you guys covered a lot there, but Carmen, if you wanted to write your email in the chat, we could send you some more information outside of that.
A small detail too that we often encourage folks, and it will probably be launched in that toolkit for cases, is also, if able, if the family has one point of contact designated, it's really helpful too, because you have to go through all these layers and all these agencies, and it can be very difficult. But if there's one point of contact so that the communication is being funneled, and there's consistency around who has information for what they're being told, it can also save time, because again, it's not ideal and it shouldn't be this way. But because of, things like jurisdiction and different things, families can get kind of pinged around to different places, and that loses precious time that we have. So again, I know those are not ideal solutions, but they are what I have seen be helpful to families.
I have a question about, I guess, how can we have these conversations with youth, especially knowing that they're often targeted?
Yeah, thank you. And I think your question reflects some of the things around terminology, right? A while back, this started as kind of MMIW, right? Missing and murdered Indigenous women. And then quickly we realized we needed to add G, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because we witnessed the rates of violence that girls are facing who are not even 18 years old and underaged. And so it's a very important conversation. And I think the first one that comes to mind, particularly for our younger age groups, are, quote, cyber safety, and having very real conversations in our families with young people about what's appropriate and not appropriate for messaging, and that they have open communication with trusted people. It doesn't, if whether that's a teacher, healthcare provider, counselors, parents, aunties, whoever, that they have, that they know to reach out if they are worried about messages being sent, and that you don't have to be nice if they are uncomfortable and someone is asking inappropriate things of you, that it's not important to be nice, it's important to shut that down and to stop it. And so, for youth particular, I think having those kinds of conversations, or making yourself, if you have the capacity to be available for young people, and letting them know to reach out, I think is really important. Again, just because I've worked in this work a whole lot, and seen how cases roll out, so many of them sadly start with just inappropriate messages that don't get shut down, and then they spiral out of control. We've had young people come from small communities and get trafficked essentially to the city and then go missing, and it all started with just inappropriate direct messaging, whether that's on Instagram or Facebook Messenger or things like that. So for young people, I would highly recommend kind of looking into ways to have those conversations to keep them safe.
Thank you, Charlene.
Oh, Deborah, you're on. Awesome. Deborah shared in the chat. Sorry, I don't see everybody. So thank you for jumping in. Yes, Deborah shared about the toolkit hopefully being available soon. And then there have been the working group and others, such as Native Peoples Action and folks, have been leading some policy asks. Again, Data for Indigenous Justice has specific asks about mandatory reporting in the sense of data, sorry, that law enforcement be required to report on certain demographics and have reporting, that they at least have to report to the federal NamUs database. So there's lots of policy pieces moving to, which could be a whole separate webinar. And I think ANTHC might be reaching out to NPA and others doing that policy kind of work. Deborah is an expert in that area too. So there's a lot of layers of policy, both at the state level and the federal level, that need to get put in place.
I guess I just want to add on to that. Please feel free to email either myself, I'll put my email in the chat, or Debbie with resources like this, and we will gladly share that information with our network.
Yeah, and I know we're at the hour, so folks are really joining over, you know, I know people have work schedules, so if you need to go, no worries. I just want to recognize your time. And then respond to what was in the chat. So yes, rape culture is a huge problem, the narrative around it, but then also the lack of policy. Yeah, thanks, Colleen. And again, our lack of protection through policy and law. So just over this weekend, actually Saturday, HB 5 had a hearing around having a definition of consent in the state. I know that sounds wild to probably many people that we don't have one, but we haven't had one, and it's contributed to the lack of injustice that we see, particularly in prosecution. And so there's House Bill 5 that was put forward by Guarantar. I personally wrote a letter of support, and I know that some of the orgs that I work with also wrote letters of support for that. And so again, we really hope that something like that gets put in place because of what was put there in the chat. Someone can be passed out and not give their consent, and it isn't considered rape. And so there's many problems like that, you know, that need to be addressed. So there are some bills. There's a lot of bills actually right now that I think advocates are trying to puzzle together ways to make an important impact for change. And one of those is the consent bill. So that's HB 5, if you'll think you want to look it up. Oh, thanks, Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca.
I have a question, Charlene. First
Yeah.
of all, I'd like to commend the working group that did the research to come up with the 229 cases. I mean, I know there's a lot of work involved with that. And my question is, how far back, what is the earliest year back that that number is, you know, the first case? And also, do you know of any work being done with boys and men? And yeah, those are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So again, with the report that you'll see, there is not as much specific information about dates or location, and that has to do with the lack of reporting that agencies are required to give. But what I'll say and describe about the data, so for example, one of the barriers to data that we have is that some agencies don't have digitized data past, for example, 2013. So we are seriously only able to pull data from only as recent as 2013 and not before that. Some cases 2009. And again, that isn't very long, right? And we know we've had cases of missing and murdered people much longer and way before that. So that's one of the limitations to the dates. However, because this is led by community, I think the oldest case in my database, for example, is from the 60s. And I have that not because law enforcement agencies have reported it and that it's able to be Googled and found in any way. But again, because communities have come forward and given me that information to take care of and to add to the database. So that one in Elder, for example, I remember the moment someone gave me that information. It was a case from the 60s and it happened in the interior. And so I wrote actually 2 names down from that time period. So I have 2 cases, for example, from the 60s, but it doesn't mean I have consistent data from the 60s on. So it's very piecey and kind of spliced up. And again, the methods, if you're a data person and a research person, it kind of makes you want to pull your hair out. But that kind of gives you a picture of what it looks like. So I can't, that's why again, in the report, I didn't want to say this data is from the 60s because that is inaccurate. But we do have some cases, for example, I think one of my older cases is from the 60s. The second question you asked was around boys and men. And this is a really important conversation that I hope we can keep having with all of you and others in our community to shape an important narrative on how we talk about different forms of violence. So yes, men and boys face a lot of violence as well. Men and boys are also sexually assaulted, and Alaska Native men and boys face incredibly high rates of homicide, and they actually have higher cases than women in the state. Why is that not in the report? Because when we talk about gender-based violence, the contributing factors and the ways that different genders, particularly feminine identifying people, face violence is very different than the ways that boys and men face violence. And so it's been important for me to make sure as we do that, we do it in a way that articulates the difference and the connections of colonial violence, but make sure they don't get misconstrued, because I think a lot of people automatically kind of feel protective of saying, well, hey, what about this, you know? And so it's just been really important to me to try to navigate that conversation in a good way that reflects our experiences, shared and different. But yes, when I pull data, I have oftentimes males as well, just by the way that I'm given data. And I don't discard it once I cross-reference it, I keep it separately. So I am somewhat tangentially tracking that as well, because I do think we do need to get there as a community and as a people to start addressing and talking about that. So thank you for asking that, Debbie.
We have a question that's kind of related to that, and you've kind of touched on this already. But for a person who's interested in data specific to LGBTQ and two-spirited people in Alaska, what do you recommend as a resource? I know you're working on that, but in the meantime, are there any resources? And then also for a person who's interested in designing health education material for LGBTQ and two-spirited people in Alaska in regards to human trafficking and missing and murdered Indigenous persons, who can that person connect with, and what are the resources available?
Oh my goodness. Oh yes, Rebecca put in a men's engagement events, and the men's engagement leads on that program that Rebecca's putting there in the chat. They're wonderful people. So yes, reach out to them. They're really great. Native Movement also has some men's events coming up April 7th. You can find that on our social media. And then also for LGBTQ health education and representation and data, if you want to contact me and we can have a whole meeting about this, that would be great. One of the proposals I put forward, and one of that is specifically the area, the data gap that I think Data for Indigenous Justice would like to start unpacking and unlayering next, because as invisible as Indigenous women have been in this crisis, LGBTQ and trans and two-spirited people are even more so. And I think that that is an urgent area to explore and understand. So I don't necessarily have, so I don't, actually, I will say it straightforward. We can't collect, we don't have data collected for us in that area again, because we're working in a binary system. Are there better ways to collect it in ways that we could talk about? Absolutely. And so I'm hoping, you know, for that to be a priority area for the database, at least in the next, in this year and going forward. And then some of the other areas we talked about, such as location, men's data and things like that. So yeah, thank you, Kathleen, for putting that. Yep, and there's more resources. Hi, Julia. I didn't see all these wonderful people. Hi, Julia. So we're choosing our roots there. Wonderful resources, really good work being done. The Trevor Project, a national effort, really great stuff. So please reach out to any or a few of us here. And I know Rebecca is a wonderful resource and has been so supportive of this too at ANDVSA. Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I would love to connect with you more on that. And thank you for joining. I'm writing.
I'm trying to capture this information too, Charlene, so I'll be sure to share that with you, and some of it's relevant to Kelsey too.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I love this opportunity to share resources and how many groups are interested and available and want to be there to meet the different needs of our community, and that we can work together on this. So yeah, I just really appreciate this space. Other questions?
If there are no other questions, I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation today, Charlene. And I'm excited to see all of the different groups in the chat too that are doing some of the work out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And I definitely want to invite Julia. She asked if she can make a shameless plug. There's absolutely no shame here. That's what this open discussion is for. So if anyone else has any other announcements after Julia, please feel free to share.
Thank you so much. I am putting a link over in the chat. Choosing Our Roots is partnered with Tundra Women's Coalition to hire a co-director of services in Bethel, and we prefer to hire somebody that's living in Bethel. This might be a great place to get some data collection, especially for 13 to 24-year-olds who are experiencing housing instability. So if you know anybody who is job seeking, we want to work with them. And that's over there. And also, thank you. This was so good to listen to today, and I'm so grateful for the information in the community.
Thank you, Julia. They do really good work over there at Choosing Our Roots. And I'm so glad the program is expanding to the Bethel region. Such good stuff. Well, thank you again to ANTHC for this webinar series, and I'm happy to connect with you all over email for some more in-depth things, but go ahead and check out, whether it's on social media, the MMIWG2S Alaska page, any of our websites. But yeah, happy to share more and make connections. This was really wonderful, and thank you to the Justice Center for jumping on and also sharing. They've been really great to work with as well. We have really good people and partners that I'm so glad we're communicating and connecting on.
Thank you so much, Charlene and Kelsey. This was definitely very insightful. You shared a wealth of information, and I think there's a lot for us to implement in our different practices.
Yeah, thank you, Koyan, and I'll just stay on in case anyone needs anything. Julia Terry website. Thank you. Yeah, Every bit makes a difference.
This is Roxanne Franken Fairbanks. I was wondering, years ago, I facilitated a group for women for childhood sexual abuse. And I was wondering, I know there's need for it among the Native, but I was wondering, have anybody been trained on holding support group for this? And what, we use was the Wounded Heart book. But I was just wondering if anybody in the state has been trained for this and if there would be training for this for adult women.
Yeah, I think the ANTHC folks probably have the training available from their programs, but other ones that come to mind, ANDVSA might be a good one. Awake has also supported my organization in being willing to facilitate those conversations. And then the YKHC one, I'm going to mispronounce it, but if anyone knows and wants to correct me, I think it's like Chuggy Chaga. They do a really beautiful training as well at YKHC.
Thank you.
Yeah, are there others on the call who have resources for that that you know of or partner with?
There was a training by White Bison several years ago where it was specific for communities that have lost women or children to missing, murdered Indigenous women. And they offered like a whole facilitator training. I'm not sure if they still offer it or not, but they do have a manual and it did come with the documentaries that they created.
Family Wellness Warriors Initiative at SCF probably might have resources as well. Now that you say that, I'm like, oh yeah.
I guess what I'm asking is, like, we use the Wounded Heart book and it's a faith-based book. And I wondered if, and I've been to the sacred, training. I've worked with Debbie.
Okay.
I'm very, but I was just wondering if there was any other kind of facilitating using our culture. And it's specifically for sexual abuse survivors. I think for me, I think there's a need for that here in the state of Alaska for that, because it affects, I'm a survivor myself, it affects us in many ways, relationship-wise, self-low esteem, going from one relationship to another, and I think that having knowing that it wasn't their fault and have them walk through that.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Roxanne. Thank you for sharing that.
Something one of the other projects I'm involved in, it's not exactly what you're looking for, Roxanne, but I'm on a team called 49 Days of Ceremony, and it's really developed for opioid misuse, but we've kind of taken a much broader approach, and it's just like a generalized like indigenized trauma recovery program, and actually a focus on wellness too. That's something that we're still developing, and I'll note your name. We're going to be doing actually next month as part of the Alaska Indigenous Research Program, will be kind of piloting that program. It's project-based, so we'll be building this canoe that Charlene mentioned earlier that will be dedicated to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We're kind of selectively inviting people, so I'll just note your name and see if I can invite you to that as well. But just know that's something that we're working on, and I'm not sure how much longer it'll take for us to like make that publicly available, but I'm sure others are doing work in that direction too.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to put Debbie on the spot. Debbie, is there anything that you wanted to share or add to this presentation? Just knowing that this is part of ANTHC's efforts to work together with communities to keep our people safe.
Yeah, so I just want to really thank everyone for coming here today and invite you to the next 2 webinars that we have scheduled, and we'll go ahead and try to get that more description on our link there so that you can be able to share it with your contacts as well. And I really appreciate all the work that's done with the report, Charlene, and all the work that you have done with you and your team. That's just, you know, that really does show a lot, especially because, you know, you shared some that you even received, you know, a couple of those all the way back to the 60s. And that's a long ways back. And that's such a needed, and we keep hearing about how the data is not being there. And so I'm really excited about your organization, and I really commend all the work that you did. But I'd like to invite everyone to come back and participate if you can in the next couple webinars. And thank you, Kelsey, for being able to join in with Charlene today. I appreciate that. And I'm excited about Roxanne's question, though. I think she could probably partner with someone and be a part of that work. Roxanne, you know, I always like to put it back on the person who asked the question. So, yeah, I think there is a need for that. That's a really great question that you asked. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for hosting us, and appreciate everybody's time and coming together. And yeah, stay in touch, and I look forward to the rest of the webinars. And again, reach out, and then you can find all those events and points of contact on social media or on our website. Or ask Kathleen.
Sounds good.
Thank
Have
you.
a great
all.
afternoon, everyone.
Yeah,
Mhm.
take care.
You. Thank you, Charlene.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
I don't know if I asked you yet, Charlene, but are you okay with this recording being publicly available?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
Yeah. If you post it, let me know so then I can share it out.
Yeah, definitely. It should be made available through ANTHC's one of their learning channels. So I'll let you know once we have that posted, and I'll share the link with you.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, I hope you have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. I'm so glad for all the questions and all the folks that joined. You know, when you're sharing your screen, you can't see everything or everybody. So I was like, oh, they're here. Really great. I'm glad that people are able to share more about all their org's work and everything.
Yeah, me too.
I did.
Thanks so much, Charlene.
Yeah, nice to see you. Thank
Good
you
to see you too.
for having me and look